Hello YouTubers. This is the 7th video where we continue our Blazor from scratch series. And this video is, in the previous, episodes we talked about, how to build the entire data pipeline. We talked about brokers, integrating these brokers with an API, and then, we touched base a little bit on the services, and then we dived a little bit deeper into building validations and processing and exception handling and integration with the brokers. And then we talked a little bit in the last two videos actually, about building view services. And we talked a little bit about how these view services basically prepare your model that's incoming, your view model that's coming from the outside world, into a native model that your API actually can process and handle and persist in the database. So we're getting very, very close. Our ultimate pipeline for the series is to be able to basically, put in some information for a student and then hit the register button. A screen would show up and say, "Thank you, this student has been registered," and then we go back into our database and see that the student value has been registered. Once we do that, then now you have the entire experience of building end-to-end Blazor application. And if you're following out on the other series that I am building with the coding standard and guidelines, you should be able to actually build from the database from nothing really all the way up to the model, brokers, services, controllers, and then you jump into the brokers, services, view services, and then the UI components. That's what I call a full stack engineer, like I have mentioned previously in multiple occasions. All right, so today we are talking about base components. Let's go back to our map here and our journey here. There is our map. And in our map here, we're basically working with the base components. Like I said, we talked about building the APIs, brokers, services, view services, and we test-driven each and every piece of those. We made sure that these pieces are doing what they're expected to do. Today, we're going to start with this base component. Let me explain something to you just so you understand. Base components are the equivalent of brokers in a backend or data pipeline. So there's a data pipeline, and then there's the UI pipeline like this. The data pipeline, there are brokers, and these brokers' main responsibility is to play the role of a wrapper. And this wrapper basically wraps any external dependency API calls. You could be using a broker to pull, date time from the system. You could be putting a message on a queue. You could be talking directly to storage, whatever the case may be. A broker is, I put it in the sense of that it's a more general term of a unit of work pattern, right? Because brokers basically are indicative by definition on the fact that they try to interact with something outside of your realm of control. It could be an API, a storage, it could be data, whatever the case may be, right? So base components are something very similar to that, except that what they're actually wrapping is not quite an external resource, it's an external UI component, right? There are native UI components and there are external UI components. An external UI component basically is what you get natively outside of the box. Like if you go in here, let's share our screen here real quick. If you go into your code here and you type in something like this, this is our base. You type input like this. This is a native UI component, and you don't want this actually to control directly your business logic. It's what I call UI components. So these components are the equivalent of services, and these pages are the equivalent of controllers, basically, in an API. So this guy here, so you have this pipeline in here. And we're trying to build base components so we can allow people to use our system, people who are going to be using the schooling system in real life, to enter some information and hit the button, and the information will fire up and go to the API in a very, very solid, maintainable, testable, configurable software. Let's visualize these base components a little bit further. So this here, this green guy here, is not the Hulk. This green guy here is your base component. Let's call it Textbox base. So this Textbox base guy in here is basically the wrapper around whatever native or external component. You could be using, Sync Fusion UI components. You could be using Telerik. You could be using the native component. Whatever that component is, something that you haven't built with your own hands, is something native or external that you don't have control over, and you're trying to put this wrapper around it so you can control it and test it and play with it and be able to run your end-to-end testing knowing full well that you can control this particular component. All right, great. That's a good deal. Inside this native component, there's another one. Inside of this base component, there's this little guy here, and this red guy is basically your native component, right? Or external component. So in this particular instance here, that would be the input, this tag, this HTML input tag. This is a control. It's a native control that exists on every browser since the beginning of browsers. Since I remember, as far as I remember, 1997, back when I started with this software industry, input was still there. People were still reading huge HTML books of 1,000 something pages, and they would use input to build static HTML pages. That was the web back then. What this Textbox base component, what it basically offers is APIs. Watch this. APIs. And these APIs basically allow you to, let's put this like this. This is an API. These APIs allow you to programmatically interact with this native component without having to worry about whether that native component gives you that kind of capability outside of the box or not. Like all the inconsistencies that are in the world when it comes to external components, like working on Blazor projects now for over a year and a half, real life enterprise Blazor applications. I have noticed these external components come in all different shapes and forms. And if you want your component, your actual business logic, your service-like piece of software in the UI realm to actually be configurable to match any UI framework you want to use, then you have to engage base components. Because base components' main responsibility is to hook up the native capability of setting up a value on some UI component and then exposing that capability for you to match a particular contract that your components subscribe to. That's really all that it is. So how does that really work? Let's just describe the problem here. Let's say this is an input and I want to programmatically be able to go and say set value like this. And you're passing in a string in there. I want to programmatically in my unit tests, instead of doing search and then set value and do some hacky stuff, we want to make sure that this is solid. In order for me to make sure that this is solid, I want to programmatically have strongly typed APIs that allow me and give me that kind of power and that kind of functionality. So if this is a text box, I want my text box to allow me to have a function that allows me to set a value in there. There's another aspect for it from a best practices standpoint, but let's just build the base component together. So here's what I'm going to do first. First and foremost, this is a great opportunity because now you get to see what it's like to upgrade an existing Blazor application to .NET 5. And I'll show you why we need .NET 5 in a second. But let's just clear out all the things that we built when we started this series, just so I can give you an overview, a walkthrough, real fast walkthrough about what I'm doing in here. I'm going to delete everything, right? I'm going to take away all these things. So we have bases, we have components, and then in the index area, I'm going to delete all of this stuff. All of this going away, including the unit tests. In the components area, I'm completely, removing all of this. We don't need any of it. It's all gone. So that's number one thing. Clean up all the UI. I already talked about this in the overview area. No need to look at this at the moment, because the next videos, all the videos that we're going to be doing starting from now, is going to be nothing but very specific details about what needs to happen in here. All right, so this is the first thing. Let's make sure the solution builds. All right, we got a couple of errors in here. Let's get rid of it. bases. Let's take this out. I don't think that's the real error. Let's see. So this guy here is out. Like this. And let's build again. And great. If you really want to get real feedback, sometimes Visual Studio lags off or tries to be smart, so it caches some information, especially when you're running tests. That's for the front end and the back end, not just for the front end. You know, when you run your tests like this, if you have big enough solution with some 3,000-4,000 tests, sometimes Visual Studio is gonna try to optimize, gonna start to be smart, you know, and cache some results for you. So it's not possible that you're looking at all 3,000. Well, I want to get a good feel of what my system looks like. So what I'm gonna do here, if you really want to get real feel of what the results of your test is, just go here and type .NET test, just like I did up here. So .NET test basically will build the solution, clear the cache. That's basically what kicks off on the Azure pipelines when you're committing a PR. When you're submitting a PR, it runs in the tests. I'm assuming that you have builds to gauge, you know, or gate, you know, the PRs from getting merged, you know, if they have build issues, and they'll kick off all the tests for you. That's really what runs. But there's a problem here. You see, the little problem that I have here is that it says not .NET Core 3.1. The people who know me know that I like to stay with the latest and greatest, right? So let's just go ahead and upgrade. You know, just for funsies, let's upgrade this to .NET 5. In order for you to be able to use .NET 5, please make sure that you are using a more recent version of Visual Studio. In this instance here, 16.8. Anything after that is great. You know, download it, get it, and you want to make sure that you install .NET 5. So this is .NET 5 for this one, and this one should blow up because this one also needs to be in .NET 5. So here's this guy here, right, like this, and then let's ensure that everything still works. So I'm going to kick off my tests again, but this time it should say .NET 5. Let's see if that's true. Here we go. See the difference here? Now it says .NET 5. That's it. That's how you upgrade your Blazor application, .NET 5. No, not so fast, right? This is only working really, really well simply because I don't really have anything built yet. You know, so it's like Mike Tyson says, every man has a plan until they get knocked in the face, right? So the true test here is when I actually build a lot of UI components and a real functional system end to end, and then I go and upgrade and see what breaks. From my experience with systems that are really huge, when I upgraded to .NET 5, it was just as smooth as this. The only thing I needed to do is just upgrade Eagle Hansen's library, you know, the library that he built and called it BUnit. It's a very, very good library for testing Blazor applications. You just want to upgrade this guy in here. So this guy is at 8. I'm just going to put it at 11. Once you do that, even if you have existing UI components and you're doing the tests and all that, I promise you it'll just work like a charm. That's the only thing I had to do. All right, so these two errors should disappear in a second, and if they don't, we'll make them disappear, no problem. Let's go and build this again. Right click, build. What other updates in here? We have the test and mock. Sure, why not? But I don't want experimental though. I want the latest and greatest stuff. So this is okay. This is on a stable version. I'm okay with that. And mock actually just upgraded the library recently, so why not? Let's do that too. All right, what else do I need to upgrade? If you really, really, really want to go and upgrade to .NET 5, and I think I made another video about this in upgrading .NET 5, you probably want to go into your manage NuGet packages and then look into potential upgrades. Let's see, if I go into edit my project here, yeah, it looks like it's all good and dandy in here. It looks like that's it. You upgrade it to .NET 5. There's nothing in here. I thought I was gonna upgrade some .NET stuff, but I'm not. I'm not upgrading ASP.NET stuff or any of that. It's all good and dandy. And then this shared folder, I don't think I care much about that at the moment. So let's just go ahead and build this. And I'm gonna make sure that the application is actually running before we actually start working on. Okay, so we do need shared because it's in there. That's where you have the basic UI stuff. Let's just build again. Yeah, there you go. That's full build. To make sure that things are actually working, I'm going to go into my index razor here. I'm going to put a label. And I'm going to say welcome to .NET 5.0. And let's run this guy and let's see if that's actually the case. Did we actually have a full upgrade? Do we actually have a fully functional Blazor application where you can? There you go. So they welcome to .NET 5. So that means we have a functional index.razor page that actually has .NET 5. Now let's start with the good stuff, right? Let's go here and make a commit. Upgrade the entire solution to .NET 5. Remove all UI related components. So I removed everything. I'm going to push this all the way upstream. And then let's go ahead and start actually doing some serious work. So I want to build a base component. Like I said to you before, if we go back to my map while this guy is working here, if you go back to my map here, you will notice I need a text box because my student model requires, this is where the business meets engineering. You know how to build things, but business will give you a purpose to build what you're trying to build, right? So in here, I want to build a text box base so I can enter, for instance, the student name, for instance. I want to enter their middle name, their family name or last name. I want to enter some information about that student based on the model. And I think the model that we have in here today, this model here is basically requiring us to enter an identity number, first name, maybe a date of birth, and select a gender. These are the things that we have to pass in. You know, so there are 4 mandatory things and there's 2 optional things that we have to pass in. How are we going to do this mapping, right? So I need a whole lot of text boxes in here to allow me to do that kind of functionality. So let's just start with the text box. This is the conceptual aspect of this, to build a text box and to show you the functionality that you can use to build that text box. So I'm going to go into the views area here, and I'm going to create bases. So there is bases, components, pages. Just like how we have, you know, brokers, services, and controllers. We have here bases, components, pages. And in the bases, I'm just going to go ahead in here and create a new Razor component. I'm going to call it text box base. That's my Razor component. But then I also want to write in the C# that's underneath that. You will see in a lot of Blazor videos, I watch a lot of Blazor videos online just to see what people have to say. Needless to say, anything for Daniel Roth, anything for Steve Sanderson, you know, these 2 particular engineers, they're geniuses, you know, really, because they're, you know, they are the ones behind this entire revolution of bringing C# to the web, right? Anything for these 2 individuals is important, but anything outside of that, also watch and see what people are doing. I'm not, you know, the stuff that I try to teach you here are not exactly, you know, they don't just come out of the blue. You got to search the web, learn, and condense, you know, the information and kind of process that information and use it in something practical, and then try to educate people about, you know, what you've learned. You know, this is how the software engineering industry should evolve. You learn things teaching. If you know something, teach something. You know, don't keep it for yourself. Run it through people and see how things are going to work for you. So right, so this is Textbox. You'll see in a lot of Blazor demos that people will go and do stuff like this. String, here, I'm going to say private string x equal Hassan. And then people will go like this and say label X like this or something like that. Why do people do that? This is only for demo purposes. If your production code looks like this, I won't allow your PR to merge in, and I'll tell you why. On the web, a long time ago, somewhere 1997 or even before that, with the evolution of, you know, of software and the evolution of the web, and then the, you know, the big, you know, bang of the JavaScript and jQuery, and then after jQuery, hundreds of, you know, thousands of libraries, React this, Vue.js this, and all these different UI libraries started to just flood the market, and then Node.js came in to have, you know, one seamless experience for the engineers to build back-end and front-end stuff in JavaScript. At the beginning of all this, there was this idea about obtrusiveness and unobtrusiveness in the code. What does that really mean? People said, okay, I can write CSS. Like web pages in the beginning, they used to look something hilarious like this. You go and say HTML, they still do underneath, but with the frameworks and all that stuff, it basically does that work for you. People used to do this. You have HTML. Let me see if it would See, it's not even doing the indentation for me. People go like do this, and then they go and say style. And underneath that style, I think that even lives in the header. And then underneath that there is script. And they go and say type text/JavaScript. Like this. People used to do that stuff. And maybe put this guy in a header, I think. Header or head. See, that's really old school stuff. Like this. And people started saying, well, this is the body, this is the script, this is the type, text JavaScript. You know, I think that the script also used to go into the head. Is that right? Something like that. Right? And then inside this, people started going and saying, well, var x equal hello, and they type in their JavaScript in there. Right? So all kinds of things that you could think of. People used to say this dot document dot find element by ID. See? Get element by ID. And they used to say, well, this is my text box, and stuff like that. This used to be the world. And then people used to go and say, okay, this is, you know, my text box. And my text box, maybe it has a border of 1 px black and a double black. Or something like that. 1 px, whatever. So, and then people used to go in the HTML in the body itself, and they used to say input type ID, I don't know, text box, and they used to do that stuff. What's the problem that you're seeing in here? I don't know why it's really mad about the script, though. Let's see what it's saying. The script element allows authors to include dynamic script blah blah blocks. Script tags should not be placed inside components. Oh yeah, it's complaining because I'm placing inside of a component. If you go up front in the app, not the app area, if you go up front into the host area, you'll see the script right here. Look, script. Right? So this is the area. This is what the web used to be like, right? And people kept writing huge apps that looked like this. People started writing huge apps that look like this. So they started putting more and more CSS in here. So this CSS would look something like this. And you have to scroll some 300 lines of code until you actually get to the HTML. The one problem that you will notice in here, which is a terrible things for the engineers that are dealing with this, is that you're switching context all the time. Like cognitive resources wise, this is hell for anybody. Because your brain is trying to interpret CSS styling sheets. And then you're jumping into scripting, and then you're jumping into HTML markup, which is terrible. You know, obtrusive, unobtrusive wise, it's really bad. Right? So people went and said, okay, maybe we should split those apart. So instead of doing all of that stuff, why don't we go and create CSS files that contain all the style sheets, and .js files that contain all the JavaScript, and .html files that contain all the HTML stuff. So this way you have separation of technologies, separation of concern. It's a lot easier on your eye, especially when you're reading. Like if you're reading a file like this, that's not a big problem. But if you're reading hundreds of lines of code where you have to switch the context like this, it's very hard to read and very repulsive. Like if I look at something like this, I'll be like, I don't want to see this. Let me go refactor this from scratch. Let me break it into 3-4 different categories and see how this works out. This idea here is what I'm going to bring to you in your Blazor experience. So I'm going to remove all of this. And because we upgraded to .NET 5 and because we're using Visual Studio, I think 6.18 or 16.8. So 16.8 is basically how you're going to be able to do this. Number one thing, I want to create a special file to contain the logic, the C# code. So please don't go and do something like this. That's terrible. This is great for demos, but otherwise, don't do that. What you want to do is that you want to go like this and say new class and type in Textbox base. It's the exact same name as your component, but it's .razor.cs. Look what's going to happen right now. You're going to get an error. There's an error, and the file is going to nest right under your UI component. So what does that mean? That means that this file actually belongs in here. The reason why it's erroring out is because there is already a class declared with the exact same name. Where is that class? It's this guy. A Blazor eraser file is nothing but a C# class underneath, right? It's just C# class underneath. It's doing some magic with the HTML. So in order to make this work, let's declare this as partial class. Now this guy is happy. Why? Because both of them became one. Like this guy and this guy are now one class. And this is a feature you'll only see in C#. Go check out Java, go check out Python, all that. The idea of partial classes that a lot of people today, unfortunately in the .NET world today, a lot of people say, I don't like partial classes. They're actually very powerful. Simply because if you're saying you're doing OOP, if you're doing OOP or you're doing object-oriented programming, objects are 3D. So they have different aspects. So that's a part, and that's a part, and that's a part. An object has different parts. It's 3D. You're programming in the 3D universe. In fact, actually, it's infinite number of aspects. You know, this is like aspect programming. You're looking at different aspects to the same object. In fact, in Blazor, the beauty of this is the UI aspect of it, and this is the logical aspect of it. Just like in the ye olden days when you used to build Windows Forms applications, you used to have a UI renderer, and in the back end, you have the C# code. This lives until today. You can see it in WPF, Xamarin, mobile apps. You can see it everywhere. Even in the Windows Forms apps today, you still can see this when you're building desktop applications. So this is the logic behind the markup. So this guy is just for markup. For me to go and say input like this is markup. And this is the logic. And maybe if I need CSS, and this is the thing that I'm very grateful for with the .NET ASP.NET team, Daniel Roth and friends. What they basically did is that they went and said, okay, we want to also allow the separation, you know, with the CSS file. So let's have every component has its own CSS file, which is beautiful, beyond beautiful. All you have to do is just go here and say new file or new item, and just type the exact same thing, textbox base.razor.css. Look at this beauty in here. Look at this area in here. In this area here, you have the CSS stuff with its own little logo for the file. You have the C# stuff, and you have the markup stuff. This is the best programming experience of the web so far. In 20 years, I can tell you this right now. Very beautiful, seamless experience that helps you actually build a truly industrial, configurable, maintainable software. All right, enough with this. Let's get on with what we're actually trying to do. I want to build a wrapper around the native model or a native component, UI component. In this particular instance, that native component will be this input, native HTML input component. This native HTML input component needs parameters, right? Like for instance, I want to pass in a value to this guy. I want to call this my value. The problem here is that this guy here thinks that this value is just a text of value. I want to actually make this dynamic. I want to pass the value in, and the value, you know, goes through, and I can read the value and all that kind of stuff. So what do I need to do? I need to create a parameter. Let's put the copyrights here just to ensure whoever uses this application is bound by our contract to donate, if there is a school, to donate that money to the economically disadvantaged poor children of the world. So I need a parameter, and this parameter basically, I'm going to type parameter in here. And this parameter basically is what allows your component to be treated like a method. And I'm going to show you that in a second. I'm going to show you that in 1 second. So this parameter is value. So I'm going to go and do prop string. I expect it to be a string. Whatever you pass in the text box, whether it's a date or number or whatever, is going to be stringified. Because this is the web and this is how this thing operates. There are other components, native components, that we can control otherwise, but for this particular instance, yeah, it's a string. And this string, I'm going to go here in this base component and say bind value. What does this mean? Bind value meaning it's a two-way street. Whatever changes happen to this value should reflect immediately, in and out. So if I pass in information to this value, It should reflect right on here. And if something is being entered in this text box, in this input, it's going to come through and I'll be able to read it. It's just as simple as that. So I'm binding this value in here. But I'm going to do one more thing and focus with me. In order for you to build components that are easy to test, you need to offer APIs that allow you to mimic the UI behavior. You need to be able to mimic this UI behavior. The UI behavior is that I'm going to go in and just type in some values in the input, and the input is going to go through and it's going to show up. But I want to allow people, some people say, well, you have a getter and a setter in here. That's not the right way to actually input information into a component. Even Visual Studio will bark at you. It'll tell you, you can't do that. Because these values are supposed to be passed in through the component itself, not through a setter and a getter, right? But what we're going to do here is that we're going to build a little function here. See that little function here? I'm going to call this setValue. And this setValue will take in an input parameter that's called value. So this dot value equals value. This is only for us to be able to expose an API that allows us to test this guy, to mimic the UI behavior. Instead of searching around and finding something by ID and then injecting the value in the component, that's really, really, really bad. Don't do that when you're building Blazor applications. And if you're a backend engineer, this is your lucky day because it's very straightforward. We're dealing with UI through C#, through straightforward code. So here I set up the value to this component. Now, what am I supposed to do? So this value here is set up to this. Let's test this. Let me just show you what this looks like. This is it. This is all base components, just a simple base component that gives you that power and ability to be able to test it this way. So what do I want to do here? I want to go into my page, one of my pages in here, and I want to show you how this works out, right? Well, let's go ahead in here. Obviously, never ever, like if you look at our UI model here, never ever use a base component in the page. That's bad because it's not testable. You can't go through like that. You need to use these base components to build a component and then use that component to actually process the information that you want to process. Do not use base components. That's like using brokers in a controller layer. Bad. Bad. There's no validation. Nothing is going on. It's just, it's free for all, right? And there's no data interaction. Like if you go like this, if you go all the way up here, how are you supposed to be able to call your data pipeline? Unless you call your data pipeline from the page, and if you have 3 different components in one page, you're going to be calling 3 different view services, and it gets so bulky and so bad and so dirty so fast. Do not do that. Okay. So this is my base components. Let's go here just for testing purposes. I'm just going to go here and say, this is my Textbox base component. And here's a using. You know what? Let's not do it through the page. Let's do it right. Let's do it through the component so you don't have to confuse people. So in the components here, I'm just going to build a simple component in here. I'm going to call this student registration component. Right? This video is not about these components specifically. I'll make sure this is clear. This is just to show you how you can build base components and build a nice UI just simply by building these base components. That's all that it is. All right, so this is student registration component. And in this student registration component, I can go here and say using, and then OSSS.portal.web views bases, and that's it. In views bases, I can go here and say Textbox base, right? I'm just leave it at this. Textbox base, just like this. I didn't do anything yet. What does that mean? If I reference this component here, just like I'm doing in the UI here, if I reference this guy in here, while this guy is being referenced like this, it'll just gonna render a text box. Just as simple as that. Let's check this out. Let's see if that actually is the case. If I go in the index area in here and say using OSSS.portal.web.views.components, and I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say student registration component. That's all I'm doing. Just referencing component. Just referencing component. If I run my application like this, I should see a text box. Just a blank, bland text box that doesn't have any magic in it. Let's see if that's the case. See? Do you see this text box right here? That's basically how I'm abstracting away. Like if you look at your component specifically, you should see nothing but but custom base components that you have built yourself. Now let's take this a little bit further. Let's say I want to offer here some capability. Because my value in my base component here is a parameter, I can actually go in this student registration component and say set the value automatically out of the box to Hassan. So this is a default value on this component that says this guy is Hassan. If I go and run my application like this, my text box should say Hassan. Like this. So I passed in a parameter. It went through my custom property. And this custom property that I own, and this custom property on the base component got bounded by the input component, input UI component. Just like this. Just as simple as this. So what that means is I can then go and say, if I want to offer any additional capabilities to my UI component, I need to go to the base component first and offer that as a parameter. What's an example of this? I can go in this parameter here, and it's not like all of these parameters are not mandatory. It's up to you to put it in or not. And you can go here and say public string placeholder. I don't know if placeholder is one word or not. Get set placeholder. What that means is that I probably need another functionality like this that says set placeholder, and I'll tell you in a second why that's important. Set placeholder. This is the value, this is your placeholder. Anything that you expose, you have to offer a capability to control it through the code as if it was being changed through the UI. Does that make sense? So basically I control my placeholder, I control my value through that UI, and I'm going to show you in a second why that's important. Alright, then in my text box base in here, I can also go here and start doing some things. I can go and say here's another input parameter. And this input parameter is going to be my placeholder. Can I hold that placeholder? Yes, there you go. Bind placeholder. And this placeholder in here, this parameter that I have in here, is the same guy that I have right here. This placeholder. Let's see if we can do this. Placeholder like this. Right, so that's my placeholder. What does that mean? It means that for my placeholder, in order for me to pass this value in, I can go into my component here and say placeholder equals student name. So this way I don't actually have to put anything in the value, and the placeholder is going to take over. Is that really right? Let's see. Let's run the application and see if that works. See, student name, and it's nice, it's grayed out, it's beautiful. Is that clear? Now, so that means I can control my data back in, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So what proves to me that the data that I pass into that component is actually coming through the system? If I input any kind of data in there, what proves to me that this data is going to come through the system? Let me show you. Let's get rid of the value completely. How about this? I'm going to get rid of the value completely. It's going to be pre-initialized because it's part of this component. But instead, I'm going to go and build another base component in here. And I'm going to call it button base. So that's a button that I'm building in here. And this button is going to give me the capability and the capacity to go and execute based on particular parameters. How is that going to work? I want you to wrap your head very well around this concept. Just like everything else, I'm going to build a C# file. I'm going to call it buttonbase.razor.cs. And this button base, just like the other one, it's partialized. Let's go in here and add in some tests. Sorry, add in the copyrights. And in here, I'm going to add in component base. Sorry, base component. What is this base component stuff? Is it component base? I think it's component base. What is that stuff? Base component is already inherited in the partial class of the button base. Base component is what gives you this nice functionality out of the box, uninitialized, async, and all that. Some people say, well, if you don't need it, why do you have it in there? Because it's not visible on the Razor component. It's not really visible there. So from a readability standpoint, you want to keep it there. Now, whether you have it or not, you still have that capacity because you're in a partial class that already inherits that. But from a readability standpoint, you really want to use component base so it makes sense to the person reading your code. Where is that magic function is coming from? The same thing we want to do in here. Even if you're not going to use the built-in inherited functionality, put it in there to indicate this is a partial class of a UI component, so it's easy for someone who wants to add that functionality to go ahead and do that. Now here's the nice thing about this component base. This is where things get a little interesting, right? This button base here, if I go and say button like this button probably needs button label. Let's call it label. Label for the button. Great. So that means I can go here and input a parameter. Here's a parameter, and this is a string, and this is a label for the button. Great. So far, so good. It's perfect, right? I can go here and say this label here is reflective of the label that I pass in as a parameter. So that means I can use this to put a button and decide what the label of this button is going to be like. So if I go to my student registration component and go and say something like button base label equal OK or register, let's call it register. So we get a little bit more realistic like this. Then that means if I run my application like this, I can so easily see that register button right here. See how I'm using these base components? I want a button, here's a button. I want a text box, here's a text box. All right. These are all base components. We haven't done any of the serious work yet. I'm just getting your appetite up and running with building these UI components, trying to have you wrap your head around how this is happening. So whatever you're passing in, you're basically creating these broker-like components to allow you to input some parameters and ensure that these parameters have the right values in them. And we're going to test drive this. We're going to write tests for all of this. I want to link my button to the text box. How do I go about doing that? I want to allow that when my button is clicked, an event happens. And when this event happens, something is gonna occur there. How do I go about doing that? You can create another parameter in here for your button. And this parameter is going to be an action. You're passing in an action like a method as a parameter. So your component is passing in a method to your base component, and your base component is saying when clicked, whatever is event that happens when this button is clicked, execute. So I can go here and say action on click like this. So what does that mean? That means that I need to have a function in here, public void click. See, I'm making it public because we're going to test drive this in a second. I'm going to show you how this works. I can go here and say on click, invoke this method. See what I'm doing? So whatever function I'm passing in here, I'm going to resemble the click event. So how do I tie this to this? You can go in here and say in the button itself, unclick, attach that click function in here. Zoom in a little bit so you can see. See what I'm doing here? Since I'm breaking this into since I'm adding things in the body of the element, it's probably nice to break it apart like this. So see what I'm doing here? Unclick, go call this function, the click function. But this click function is going to do nothing but execute and trigger the function that you passed in as an action. You see what I'm saying? So what do I really want to do with this? What do I really want to do with this? I want to go into this and say, into this guy here, I want to go and say, I want to set the value, not set the value, pull the value of the button, of the text box itself. So when I type my name in there, I need to take that value and do something with it. So let's go into my component. Now my component here needs some code behind it. So let's just go ahead and create a component in here. Let's call this student registration component.razor.cs, just like how we did everything else. And this guy is also going to be partial. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And this partial guy is going to do something else now. This partial guy is going to provide me with a public void button clicked functionality. And this button clicked functionality is going to do some stuff. I want to grab the value of the text box. In order for this to happen, I need to create a reference to that text box, something that we call ref. So this is text box base, like this. I'm going to call it text box. And whenever whatever value is added into that text box, I want to be able to actually capture that when I click the button. Right? So I'm going to go here and do this. This is basically you materializing your base component into a variable that you can control programmatically. So I'm going to go here and say ref. See that ref guy? And I'm going to go here and say text box, like this. Since these are two parameters, I break them down with new lines and separate the two liners from one liners, like this. See what I'm doing here? This ref here is an attachment, programmatical attachment between this guy and this guy, which means that once this guy is in your hand, you can do whatever the heck you want with it. You can read the value, set the value, do whatever you want with it. Literally anything you want. So when the button is clicked, that means I can also pass a parameter to this guy. But I really don't care about the reference for the button. I will make notice, I will need that. But since I'm building brokers, there are no tests. I'm not writing anything yet. All the test is going to be in this component, which is going to be in the next video. I'm just trying to explain the base components to you. So what do I do with this function? You can pass this function in here. Now that this guy has another parameter, you can pass this and say onClick. Did I say clicked? What did I call it? OnClick. And then I can pass the function itself, which is button clicked, as a parameter. So the function itself is a parameter, and when this button is clicked, actually, it's going to execute whatever the component is telling the base component to execute. In our case here, I'm not going to do much with it. I'm just going to go and say string text box value equals this dot text box, which is this guy that I got, and then I'm going to get the value from it. All right, and then I'm going to go here. I don't know. I'm going to console print out. Console right line text box value, which is not really going to print anywhere, but it's something to hold off the flow with it and say this is what's going to happen. So I'm going to put a breakpoint in here just to show you that we can actually capture this value. And I want you to wrap your mind around this, because this is what UI is about. Can you pass references? Do you understand the life cycle of what's going on? I'm going to run my application here real quick. Look, and I'm going to type in here Hassan, and I'm going to type register. Oh, look what happened. The function kicked off. And the string in here is the same string that matches the text that I put in there. So let's visualize things for you. Let's visualize things a little bit. Let's go back to this view here and let me explain to you what happened. This is a text box base. And this is another one that we call the button base. And this button base is exposing a function that I can use like a parameter. And this parameter that I can use is called onClick. Is that what I called it, onClick? Let's go back to our code here. onClick. And exposing label and other things, right? Let's put all of them in here. I want you to see the full picture in here. onClick like this. So this is one guy. This guy's going to bother me. Hold on. All right, hang on. So I'm offering two things. On one side in here, I offer functions and parameters. Functions and parameters. So this here is a function. Here's my functions. So this is the onClick. Sorry, this is a parameter. And another parameter that I have is the label. The label of the button. So these here are input parameters to my component, which eventually go and control this immediately, like this. Both of them will control the component immediately and add these values immediately in there. onClick and parameters. They set up that value. And then you also have functions, which is click. The click function. I'm going to put these as orange. So this is the click function, which mimics whatever the real world click functionality, the thing that I did by hand just right now, like in the UI, is what you're actually offering with that click function. Take a look at this for a second. So instead of input, this guy becomes what? Button. See how the wrapper is exposing this functionality that eventually goes right into that base component. The same thing happened in here. What did I offer in here? I offered set value, and I offered value, and I offered placeholder. Let's do this. Something very similar to this. So this is a placeholder, and I offered value. So both of these go right straight into your base component, like this. But I also offered a functionality that's called set value that we're going to use in the test. All of these functions, the programmatical functions that I'm offering in here, are nothing but a way for you to programmatically mimic the real life scenarios. And then I went out there and I said I'm going to build a component. And this component is going to basically go and say these guys are not aligned. There you go. So this here is now my base component. Sorry, my student registration component. So this is student registration component. This is the business logic guy. This is where things happen specifically for a particular business logic purpose, a business requirement. And what this guy is doing basically, it's going and saying, here is a text box for the student name. So I attached this to this right there. I set up this value right here. So that's student name, text box. And then I created a button in here. And this button basically has a functionality. There's another function. So behind this file here, let's duplicate this. Let's send it behind the scene. Right, this guy right here. I'm going to grab it down a little bit like this, and then I'm going to send it down to the back. So this guy, this button here calls a function that your component exposes. Your component has this function called button clicked, right? So let's expose this guy here. Let's copy this guy. And this button clicked in here function is something that you attach, come on, is something that you're attaching to this guy here. Let's see if we can fix it. So I'm attaching it to this guy here. Like this. And what this guy is actually doing, because I'm passing it as a parameter, we're passing it down to this guy to mimic that click functionality. See, this is really what happened. And what this guy is actually doing, all that it's doing, it's going and calling, like this inner function, it's going and reading the value, this external value. So when I click this button here on this box, let's make this box in white, like this. When I actually click this guy like here, I click the button gets clicked, it goes and reads the value of this component. Whatever I passed in here, it's going to go and read that value. And then whatever that value is, it's going to go pass it down, like whatever that value, it's going to do some stuff with it. And whatever it's doing with that, it's passing it as a parameter. So when the button is actually clicked, it's executing this. I hope that's clear. If it's not clear, we'll go over it over and over again in this video until you actually understand it. With documentation, with everything you can think of. That's really all that I'm doing. So why do I need, sorry, this guy is not going here. This guy is going straight right here. Sorry, I misled you there. So what do I need these functions in here? This is click in here, and this is here set value. Why do I need these functions? Is because when I go test this, I don't really have the component in front of me to click on it manually. I need these things so I can mimic the click and the enter. So I enter text. When I enter text, I'm going to use set value. And when I click the button, I'm going to use click to test my functionality. See how I'm dealing with my base components as C# classes, pure C# classes, because they are. Because they are. But from an integration standpoint, this is how this is. There's a little bit more to it though. I already set the label in here, so let's just visualize this in here. This should be also visualized. So that's the label. So this guy is setting up the label and setting up the button click and passing it as a parameter. While this button click is actually reading the value. And I didn't set up the value, I just set up the placeholder. I did not set up the value. That's really what happened in here. Let's go back to our UI component here. And let's see this again. So I said register on click. Look in here, I say Hassan, and I click. So now I set up, this is the steps. These are the steps that I've taken. Let's take that label from there. It's actually really annoying for my demo. Let's go back here. Let's go into the index, and let's take that guy out. There you go. I'm just going to say here label student registration. Here. Registration. Okay. And then I can go and say, I can now go here and say, okay, this is registration. I can now run my application. Oh yeah, it's student registration. That's right. Except that it didn't really take a new line for some reason. All right. What if I put it in a div? Would you be happy? Yeah, sure. Ideally, I wouldn't do it this way, but this is just for the purpose of this demo. I'm going to do it this way just so you can see. I want you to see something nice that you can look at. Oh, it's not really letting it go down. Interesting. So, okay, you know what? I'm just going to take it completely out because I don't want to waste the video time on this. Let's just run this way. Okay, so let's visualize this again. I'm going to split the world for you here. I'm going to have you see this. So I set up the placeholder. So this is here setting up a placeholder. So that's the first thing that happened. That's number one right here. Right? And then number two, I went and I set up a label for this one. So I went and I set up the label in here. So that's number two right here. So if you go back to your component right here, I went and I set up a placeholder, number one, and I set up a label, number two, and then I set up a function, number three. That exact same order. So in here, I'm setting up this function, here, number three. All right. And then, now that I have all of this integration, if I go and click in here, immediately it'll read the value. Like what this function is doing, it's reading the value and being passed in as an on-click, and an on-click is basically going to execute this, which is basically what happens in here. Hello, Hassan Habib, register. Here's a breakpoint, and here's the value of Hassan Habib that's entered on the system. That's really all I wanted you to wrap your head around today. You can pass properties, you can set properties, you can pass them as parameters. This is today just the idea of setting up the properties and passing them as parameters and building base components. Just very simple, easy to use base components. In the next video, we're going to start talking about components, the actual student registration component, and that's when things are going to be actually test-driven development. We're going to write some code. The code is going to fail. We're going to talk a little bit about, like we talked in the introduction, we're going to talk about what's a component state, what's loading content failed, what does that mean, or error, what does that mean, you know, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to control the component rendering through these different states, right? Through the state, I can control whether my component renders error or renders failed or whatever the case may be. We're also going to go through BUnit and specifically build an entire component that integrates, like we talked in here, it integrates fully with the view services that we have in here. And these view services, what's basically going to happen is that we're going to have two base components, or three or four base components. And then we're going to use this guy in here. So the base component is going to take the student name, first name, middle name, last name, in addition to taking anything else like the date of birth and gender. And then it's going to pass this to the view service, and everything else is just going to go full stream, all the way down to the database, all the way down to the API. I'm going to show you all of this in addition to the API itself, so we can see if our actual component is actually working. Just remember this. Base components are just like brokers. They containerize at any point in time. You know, your business requirement will change and say, change all the text boxes across your entire application to have a minimum width of X and a minimum height of whatever. You can control that so easily if you have one base component that you're using across your entire application. Let's say at some point in time, I personally like the Syncfusion libraries. Some people like Telerik. You know, these are all external libraries with community licensing that allows you to actually build UI components out of the box, and you can actually use that. If I want to use a Syncfusion library, and I'm going to show you how to do that, I'm going to completely change my entire, this is, instead of using this native input HTML components, I'm going to use Syncfusion or Telerik or any other component that's out there. And you will notice absolutely zero change when it comes to your components where the business logic is. So that's pretty much it. If you have any, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's useful for you. I know this topic is a little bit complicated, but the more you do it, the more you practice it, and the more I talk about it, and believe me, I will never run out of things to say when it comes to software. So, you know, I hope that's simple for you. Feel free, absolutely 100%, to reach out to me, just like a lot of you have already been reaching out to me through the comments and the messaging and social media and Twitter, everywhere. I'm more than happy to answer your questions. Feel free to reach out, you know, so I can expand on a particular topic or explain a little topic a little bit further. It's really a pleasure showing you how the entire software is being built from the database all the way up to the UI. But more importantly, you have to understand what you're actually doing. Like, don't just follow particular steps without having a deep understanding of what's going on. And on that note, I have started very recently documenting the standard, right? So if you look in here in my personal GitHub page, you will notice in here that there's a new repository that I just started recently, which is called the standard. So this is the standard which is basically practices and guidelines on architectures. And I'm updating this every day, right? It's not yet completed, but definitely the brokers area is completed. I want you to go and read and see why I am making the decisions that I'm doing. This readable material should hopefully make things, it shows you the theory behind the practice here. What are these brokers? Why do they play the role of a liaison? You know, what are common brokers? What does a broker look like? With examples, with real life projects, and even frequently asked questions, because people ask me about this all the time. I'm operating, you know, between at least 4 or 5 different software teams that building 5 different products across the board, you know, and it's really important, you know, that I share all the questions that people have, because if you have a question, it's very likely someone else reached out to me and asked me the same question. So I try to address all of these questions. I continue to upgrade the standard and make sure. I'm going to drop a link in the comment section just for you to be able to read the standard. I just very recently started working on the services area. What are the services? What do they look like? And all the things related to it. I want you to understand how to build great software. And I want to make sure that when you're building software, you actually know what you're doing. I want you to look forward to building software. Every day you wake up in the morning, I want you to be excited, because you know what needs to happen. You already have the pattern and the standard. There's so much chaos on the internet. There's so many theories. There are half-baked theories. There's full-baked theories. You know, there's this, you know, this pattern and this principle and that architecture. And because there is this tremendous amount of information on the internet, it's so easy to get confused. So I tried to distill all of that information for you into something that I call the standard. And the standard is basically what myself and many engineers, over 22 engineers today, you know, across the board on so many different projects that I'm working on simultaneously, are following. It works. It works on bigger applications, smaller applications, whether you're building a calculator or a to-do list, or building an entire, you know, system end to end for, you know, e-commerce, or whatever the case may be. It doesn't matter what you're building. You know, this system and this pattern will support, you know, what you're working on, and it'll work just great. It'll work just great if you follow that standard religiously and make sure that, you know, you understand why you're doing what you're doing. With that note, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out and drop a comment in the comment section. I'm very grateful for all of you, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in another video.